Thank you, Ms. Zondi, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to start with greeting Advocate Strom Nzama, who is a member of the Information Regulator and also responsible for the Promotion of Access to Information Act within the regulator. I recognize Advocate Colin Weapon, who is also a member of the regulator responsible for the Protection of Personal Information Act. Today on this webinar, we are joined by a panel of esteemed guests who will be leading the discussions as we consider the issues that are part of the theme for the International Day for Universal Access to Information. Firstly, we have Commissioner Janet Love from the Independent Electoral Commission. We have Mr. Jay Snare, who is the head of Blind SA. We have Mr. Isaac Minar, who is a well-known advocate for freedom of expression and access to information. He wears many hats. He represents SANEF, he represents also regional bodies that advocate for freedom of expression. And we have Ms. Robin Pesensi, who represents an organization called My Vote Counts. It's an organization that has really led the civil society campaign on introducing transparency in the funding of political parties. We will hear a lot from them, what they have learned so far since they started doing this work, and where do they see the issue of access to information interacting with issues around funding of political parties and accountability. It's a great panel that we're going to have today. It's really a panel that was put together to take advantage of 2 or 3 different developments currently taking place in the country. Firstly, the fact that we are now in the runway to the holding of local government elections in October, but also the fact that globally, the entire movement for transparency and access to information is celebrating this international day that was endorsed by UNESCO as the day wherein we recognize the significance and the value of the right of access to information. As Ms. Zondi indicated earlier in her introduction, it is indeed the month for the deaf. September is the month for the deaf, where we recognize the needs, the challenges, the successes, and the triumphs of members of our community that live with disability insofar as deafness is concerned. What we wanted to do with this panel today was to try and piece together those strings of issues into one conversation. And so the theme that we are working under today is a theme that looks at the issue of access to information as an enabling right for inclusion of people that would ordinarily be marginalized by disability or marginalized by various forms of disadvantage, people that would ordinarily not be considered when the mainstream of society is charting the way forward for the country, for government, etc. So we wanted to be able to raise those voices. We wanted to be able to hear from communities that ordinarily are not allowed an opportunity to make their voices heard when we as activists, as government officials, as political parties engage each other on the direction that our society or the country is to take. So this is what we want to achieve today, to raise those voices that are not ordinarily heard, but also to consider how the right of access to information can be used as a leverage right to enable access by communities as I have described. So without further ado, colleagues, I would like to hand over to Advocate Strom Nzama, who will give us an opening remark. As she prepares to speak, I've just remembered that I needed to give apologies for Chairperson of the Information Regulator, Advocate Pensi Tlakula, who could not be with us during the session due to a bereavement in her family. And also to give apologies from Ms. Alison Tilly, who is attending to a family emergency as well. That being said, I would like to hand over to you, Advocate Strom Nzama.
Sorry, Mr. Dimba. I think there's just a slight change. I'm supposed to do the opening remarks. Am I correct, Advocate Strom?
My apologies, Advocate Whippen. Please, over to you.
Good morning to our participants. Good morning to the moderator. Good morning to everyone who has joined the celebration. Today is really a special day for us because we've got, I believe, a very good mix of presentations that will ensure that we continue to foster inclusion as we look at the right of access to information. Just to start off by also noting what Mr. Dimba said about inclusion, and safe to say that this year's theme for 2021 prescribed by UNESCO actually points to the role of access to information laws and implementation thereof to build strong institutions for public good and sustainable development, as well as strengthening the right to information and international cooperation. The South African context cannot be overemphasized. This year marks a turning point in the way and the manner that the constitutional requirement of Section 32 will be effected. On 1 July, we saw the transition and handover of the PIA function from the South African Human Rights to the Information Regulator. And that's a very important point to mention, because with that transition was a lot of effort put forward by the team, especially Advocate Strom, who is the designee for the promotion of access to information, and that needs to be acknowledged. With the handover of the PIA function, we safely want to state as the information regulator that it's not all about the prescribed compliance and enforcement requirements that has become effective, but it's also for us a strengthening of the existing capacity pre-July 2021 from the side of the South African human rights side. The South African Information Regulator also needs to acknowledge, the assistance and the support that was provided, as well as the cooperation by the South African human rights, especially with regards to the transition arrangements. I know Advocate Strom and the members played a critical role in the transition and the handover. It is befitting to mention that the UNESCO theme for 2021 is perfectly aligned to the efforts of the information regulator, to the prescribed theme for 2021. What we can say is that when we refer to building a stronger information regulator for public good, the PIA functions should be appreciated. And those functions, amongst others, include the promotion of timely and effective dissemination of accurate information by public and private bodies about their activities in relation to access to information, assisting any person wishing to exercise the right contemplated in PIA, especially taking into account the language barriers that we know about in the South African context, as well as our historical context that cannot be overemphasized. Investigate such complaints, act where appropriate as conciliator in relation to such complaints. And those assist the information regulator to give effect to the right to access to information. The aforementioned efforts will go a long way to strengthen the regulator and its work. And with regards to and in relation to international cooperation, it is important to mention that the ICIC Global Conference was hosted by South Africa in March 2018. This effort not only positioned the information regulator as a champion of the right to information, but also strengthened its relationship with the global community in relation to access to information. And taking it further, or one step further, under the leadership and the guidance of Advocate Pensi Tlakula and the members of the information regulator, the interim chairpersonship was entrusted to South Africa with regards to with regards to the body on the African continent for access to information. What is also very important to appreciate is that an in-depth analysis and learning and benchmarking was conducted by the interim leadership of access to information with its counterparts on the South American continent to establish a relationship and to also establish a credible and effective African structure for access to information. It is also important to mention that the South African regulator has been afforded a seat on the EXCO of the ICIC global body tasked with the right to information. And then it's also important to mention that translating UNESCO's prescribed context to the South African environment is also much befitting. What the regulator has done was to look at the upcoming local government elections, as Mr. Dimba referred to, and then see if the right of access to information can be appreciated alongside the right to vote. But what is also very important is that the local government elections will be looked at and discussed during the month of October. And the 28th of September is also a good time for that right to be appreciated alongside the right to access to information, as human rights in the main are interconnected. What is also very important to mention is that during the local government elections, the right to access to information will not only provide the citizens of South Africa with an informed choice during elections if they have information available, but it will also ensure that the right of access to information strengthens all these institutions like the IEC and other voluntary bodies in ensuring that access to information plays a critical role during the election period. By applying and promoting the right of access to information to local government elections further shows the interconnectivity of the different rights with the right to access to information. The regulator remains committed to strengthening its partnership with voluntary bodies operating in the space of access to information And we also have established existing partnerships with institutions and voluntary bodies like the Right to Know and ODEC, as well as My Vote Counts. And those relationships will be strengthened and deepened. It goes without saying that the South African human rights will continue to play a central and cross-cutting role in the work of the information regulator. In saying all of the above, it is not only befitting to mention that the focus of enforcing the right of access to information will not be done from a policing angle, but rather to create a culture of proactive disclosure. And one of the colleagues will talk about proactive disclosure. And not only to operate by enforcement, but to actually achieve a voluntary disclosure, which in turn will contribute towards the strengthening and the empowering of citizens when it comes to choice and decision-making processes. The veil of secrecy which prevailed in the previous regime was also one of the issues which led to a kind of a restraint or limited information being made available. But that culture of secrecy must be unpacked, and public bodies must ensure that they understand the purpose and the reason for holding information. And it is befitting to mention that public bodies hold information in trust on behalf of the citizens of South Africa. And that aspect of custodianship must be unpacked in future discussions, and it must be focused upon so that we can achieve the proactive disclosure with regards to information, and also to break down the veil of secrecy and limited information being shared. In saying all of this and mentioning all of this, I'd also like to state that the chairperson of the information regulator and the members remains committed to promote transparency, but also ensure that the culture of access to information is improved by awareness and by any other means that the partners that I've referred to earlier and others can agree upon. And safe to say that in this regard, the information regulator holds an open door and open policy for future discussions and engagements, not only with the citizens, but with voluntary bodies and other regulators. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Advocate Lippund. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to now give the floor to Advocate Strom Zama for her input.
Thank you very much, Program Director, Mr. Dimba. Thanks a lot. I'd like to welcome everybody. My name is Lebogang Strom Zama. I'm one of the members of the Information Regulator. I would like to welcome our esteemed guest speakers, members of the regulator, executives, staff of the regulator, and the EduComs team, and everybody who's attending the webinar. As we know, today, every year, the 28th of September, we commemorate the International Day for Universal Access to Information, IDUAI, which previously was known as the Right to Know Day. The theme for today's event is effective access to information as a human right for vulnerable groups. I would like to introduce and welcome our guests in the order of the program, and I'm going to quickly and briefly read each guest's bio. The first one is Mr. Jace Ne, who is the CEO of Blind SA, headquartered in Johannesburg, Blind SA, has had a significant influence in advocating the rights of the blind throughout South Africa. Besides his current role, Jace took on several notable positions in the past, like the National Executive Director of the South African National Council for the Blind, Secretary of SA Disability Alliance, President of the African Union of the Blind, and Africa representative of WBU. Jace has had extensive experience heading several organizations in the region. He is currently the chairperson of the Africa Marrakesh Treaty Committee and SA Copyright Coalition Right to Read campaign. He is also a representative of the WBU Marrakesh Treaty Committee and an active member of the Presidential Working Group on Disability. Alongside this position, Jace has participated in WIPO SCCR since 2009. The treaty negotiations adopted in Morocco 2013, the Sixth Africa Forum in Kampala 2015, the ARIPO workshops on the Marrakesh Treaty in Harare 2014, Maseru 2015, and Gaborone 2016, as well as the African Commission on Human and People's Rights in Banjul 2015, the AU Council of Ministers in Dakar 2015, and the Pan-African Parliament 2016. South African coordinator of the CRPD research undertaken by SA Disability Alliance with Disability Promotion International of New York University, 2014 to 2015. Our next guest speaker in the order of the program is the Vice Chairperson of the IEC, Ms. Janet Love. Ms. Janet Love has dedicated her working life to public service. She joined the IEC as a part-time commissioner in April 2016, and then a full-time as a vice chairperson in November 2018. Having played a role in fighting for freedom as an anti-apartheid activist in the 1970s, Ms. Love returned to South Africa in 1990 and immediately became involved in negotiating South Africa's new constitution and establishing its first government. She was a member of the management team at the Convention of the Democratic South Africa, CODESA, and also served as a Deputy Executive Director of the Transitional Executive Committee. This committee was responsible for, amongst others, developing and overseeing the work of critical areas of government to enable elections to proceed under direction of the 1994 Independent Electoral Commission. Ms. Love served as a member of parliament for the African National Congress in the first democratic parliament from 1994 to 1999 and was a member of the 22-person Constitutional Committee of the Constitutional Assembly, the body responsible for steering the constitution-making process. She then served in various government and civil society institutions, including working in the South African Reserve Bank for 5 years as head of strategic analysis dealing with various security risks relating to cash that affected South African financial stability. She has a strong commitment to human rights in her capacity as National Director of the Legal Resources Center since 2006. She has taken up public interest and constitutional cases on behalf of marginalized communities and individuals. Before joining the IEC in 2016, she also served a 7-year term from 2009 to 2016 as a part-time member of the South African Human Rights Commission, a Chapter 9 institution tasked with safeguarding South Africa's democracy. Ms. Love studied through the University of Witwatersrand and the University of London and has a postgraduate qualification in public admin, development management, and economics. Our third speaker, Ms. Hasensi. She is the political party funding researcher for the NGO My Vote Counts. Her work is focused on research on political party funding and democracy, engaging relevant stakeholders, creating awareness on the needs for party funding frameworks and public education. She holds an undergraduate degree in international relations and a postgraduate degree in political science from the University of Western Cape. Our last speaker is Mr. Isaac Minar. He is a media and elections consultant and a trainer currently focusing on journalism, elections, media freedom, access to information, open data, and digital rights work in South Africa and around the continent. He worked at the South African Broadcasting Corporation as an editor, SABC Digital News until 2019. His journalism career spanned over 40 years in editorial coverage and newsroom leadership roles at print, broadcast, and online media. He is a founding member of the South African National Editors Forum and serves on the Press Council of South Africa. He was also on the drafting teams of the South African Commission on Human and People's Rights 2017 Guidelines on Access to Information and Elections in Africa, and in 2019 Declaration of Principles on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa. Thank you very much. That was our the short bios of our esteemed speakers. Now I'd like to hand over to the program director for the panel members presentation. I thank you.
Thank you, Advocate Strom.
Thank you very much, Advocate Strom, for introducing our speakers. Mukalani, I'm back. So thank you very much for introducing the speakers. And I don't think we should waste a lot of time. I see we're already 10 minutes out of time. I think it's best that we call upon our first speaker to present. Can I ask the first speaker to put on their camera? Are we there?
Yes, we are
Oh,
here.
lovely.
Yes, you may profess.
Greetings, moderator, members of the Information Regulator, panelists and other colleagues. My name is Jace Nair. Thank you very much for this opportunity to present on the International Day Universal Access to Information. Blind SA is a national disabled people's organization established 75 years ago to empower blind and partially sighted persons. Currently, Blind SA has 30 member organizations throughout the country, and our main focus is programs that empower blind and partially sighted persons. We look at access to policy and legislation. We look at access to education, access to employment and economic empowerment, and we look at access to programs from an operational point of view. Last week, Blind SA was fortunate to raise the issue of freedom of expression and access to information, particularly in respect of copyright access and limitations for blind and partially sighted persons. And we were successful in the High Court, Gauteng North, where we were able to get the court to declare the 1978 Copyright Act as unconstitutional and to read into the Act Section 19D of the Copyright Amendment Bill, which provides for exceptions and limitations that allows for access to information in accessible formats for blind and partially sighted persons. My presentation today is going to focus on a general overview, particularly in terms of the access to information during elections. There are several stakeholders that are involved in this area. The first, of course, is the IEC, and I will talk to that in a minute. The second, of course, is political parties. The third is civil society organizations, and of course, the media and other interested parties. In terms of the IEC over the years have engaged with blind and partially sighted people since we raised the issue of not having the secret vote, not having access to information.
I think we've lost your audio there.
Just give me a sec. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. So like I said, in terms of the IEC, the areas of the secret vote and access to information to allow blind and partially sighted people to participate equally in the elections has been of grave concern. The outreach program of the IEC provided for publications. However, the access to information challenges that blind and partially sighted people experience. The general publications that are produced by the IEC is not produced in accessible formats. An accessible format is a format that blind and partially sighted people are able to access. And these may include Braille, large print, DAISY, which is Digital Access Information System, which is a multimedia that includes text and speech, audio, and digital formats. The adverts that are produced, particularly for television and for social media, are generally not accessible. So blind people are not able to access that information to understand what is being promoted. We do have access via radio, but that's the only medium that we are able to access. The general media is also not very accessible to blind and partially sighted people in the various formats. Therefore, active participation in civic and political life is very restricted. The IEC has produced information leaflets, particularly information on voter education and on the local government elections or the national provincial elections, but this is only available during the elections. You find that the materials are produced only in English and therefore is not available to the bulk of our communities that would want to read material in accessible formats in their respective languages. These materials are produced so late that it reaches blind people during elections or even after elections. So it makes it very difficult to use the information proactively. The number of materials produced in these accessible formats are also very limited and therefore are unable to reach the bulk of blind and partially sighted persons. The typical example of this would be the universal ballot template, which is a voting aid that was developed to enable blind people to have the secret vote. The IEC produces these UBT, but they're not available at all the polling stations. Therefore, blind people are not able to use the ballot paper effectively to mark their cross. And they may have to depend on other persons to make their cross. Therefore, having access to information, having the candidate lists in an accessible format that they are able to understand who they can vote for is paramount. The poor communication to targeted groups limits this access. Political parties, their manifesto and their communication to blind people is also very limited. In the majority of cases, we don't have access to the political party manifestos, their information bulletins in accessible formats. This is largely left to civil society organizations to try to pass information over to blind and partially sighted people. The information communication technology that the IEC utilizes has some effectiveness to them. The interactive telephone service that is provided is very effective and provides some means of information that blind and partially sighted people can access. However, majority of people do not have smartphones and therefore are unable to utilize the system effectively. The website, the design was not very accessible, but since the last election, the IEC has improved on their website accessibility. However, the smartphone accessibility applications is not so accessible. The use of robots limits the active participation of blind people in these programs. There are a number of national and international instruments that supports the access to information in our country. First of all is the Constitution of South Africa. The Bill of Rights makes provision for access to information. It makes provision for non-discrimination and the freedom of expression. The White Paper on the Rights of Persons with Disability also supports the access to information. The Electoral Act as well as the Municipal Election Act makes provision that blind and partially sighted persons have access to these resources. However, we find that budget limits the provision of these resources, and more often than not, the IEC and other Chapter 9 institutions as well as government agencies will limit the provision of accessible formats, blaming lack of financial resources, thereby discriminating and impacting on the amount of information that is available in accessible formats for blind and partially sighted persons. It is important that in order for blind and partially sighted people to participate equally and meaningfully during elections, as to casting their secret vote, or even participating as candidates for political parties or in the civic life of our economy, we need access to information in an accessible format so that we are able to digest the information and be able to use that information to ensure the appropriate responses and that we are able to participate in the social, cultural, and economic as well as civic and political life of the country. Thank you for giving me this opportunity of sharing these highlights and concerns, particularly during this period of elections and over the next 4 to 5 weeks, where blind and partially sighted people have to take very crucial decisions about the information, about the manifesto of the political parties, about how they should be casting the vote and having that access. And we hope that the information regulator would contribute to ensuring that blind and partially sighted people can have access to this non-negotiable right that the Constitution guarantees all of us. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I think for the interest of time, let us hop along to our next speaker. Then what we can do is we can have some discussions around what was discussed when all the speakers have spoken. I believe our next speaker now is, I think it's Ms. Janet Love, if I'm not mistaken. Let's have a look. Yes, Commissioner Love, my apology. You are up next. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Prof, and greetings to you and colleagues who are part of the panel, but also to the attendees. I am going to share a presentation which I'll run through quite rapidly, and I hope it appears on the screen as it is supposed to. So let's give it a try. Here we go.
Yes, you are sharing.
Great. Okay, fabulous. That's excellent. Sorry. Okay. All right. I just in going through the issues, there are obviously multiple issues, but I think the point that my starting point really was that when we're looking at issues of access to information, it, for us in the Commission, and I think for our country, invariably is going to involve looking at a whole range of other rights, but in particular, including rights that are very linked to information questions. So as much as one's talking about issues of access and how that relates in the case of elections, particularly to political rights, one's also looking at access, as we've heard from in the previous presentation, access to information for vulnerable groups. We're also looking at rights that pertain to freedom of expression, but also clearly issues to do with privacy. So from the Electoral Commission's perspective, we have to ensure that we produce information that provides clarity on the Electoral Commission's processes, including at particular moments, a level of detail that's not just about the broad frame of the Electoral Commission's work, but also deals with things to do with registration, with voting, with how complaints and objections are largely dealt with and the results, and also in relation to counting and results. We have a need to give access to what we receive in the form of submissions, whether it's in response to any of those processes. So whether it's in response to, for example, objections to do with registration, whether it's in response to questions about who are the qualifying candidates and so on. And also we need to give information in particular, and I will talk much more about this given the focus of this program, on questions to do with funding of political parties, in particular funding from private sources. And part of that, as I say, links both to PAIA as well as to protection of people's personal information. So who is our facilitated access for? It's got to be for voters, for contestants, for media, for civil society, for public at large. And I think you've heard both some of the initiatives that have been mounted by the Commission in response to the range of groups that constitute the disability sector, which is part of the work that we have tried to do over the years to enhance access for vulnerable groups. I think you've also heard in the last presentation that while we may have made progress, there's clearly going to be more progress that needs to be made. And I think the Commission is mindful of that and has been and continues to engage with the sector in stakeholder engagements to try and up our service delivery in each and every year that we operate, not just in election years. But I think it is also important for us to recognize that if we are going to provide facilitated access to vulnerable groups, as has been mentioned, the issue of timing becomes critical. So when we, for example, in these elections, face an election timetable that is not the regular timetable of 86 days, not even the timetable of 83 days, but a timetable that has had to be contracted into around 46 days, clearly the possibility, for example, for us to produce the universal ballot templates well in advance is going to be a lot more limited. And so I think some of our thinking as a society about when we make plans has got to take into account the kinds of logistics that we're going to have to deal with, When we're looking at the access to information and protection of information and elections, over the years, we've had to deal with things and obviously have to have even greater vigilance now and have received really wonderful guidance from the information regulator on a number of questions, but we have to take very careful measures to safeguard and prevent loss and unlawful access of personal information. In recent times, this has seen us have an amendment to the electoral legislation that enable us to redact ID information from the voter's roll so as to protect privacy. As many of you may know, and I will come to that further, there is also a provision in the new legislation which provides for those who make contributions to the Multi-Party Democracy Fund to request anonymity, and we obviously have to consider those requests. We also have the need for the lawful processing of information in the public interest that sometimes arises. And for example, we have been approached and have certainly supported issues that pertain to monitoring the trajectory of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, as well as to engage for the medical community to engage in reasonable preventative measures, including vaccinations. In the recent chronology, which is really the focus, we've had, and I won't go into detail about this, My Vote Counts has played a tremendous role, and I'm sure the organization will go through this in more detail. We have had the successful judgment in the Constitutional Court in 2018, which led to an understanding that voting needs to be an informed choice, and this also includes the potential impact of influence of financial support. And so private funding, particularly private funding to political parties and independent candidates, needs to be available, and that really constitutes the heart of the judgment that was taken to court by My Vote Counts. What what that was then transferred into, in part, and I say in part, I will come to that later, was the legislation that was the Political Party Funding Act. But of course, it also has seen some resonance, that court judgment, in the amendment to the PAIA Act. And the two are not completely the same, and that's something that we need to look at. So when we look at the Political Party Funding Act, clearly the foundational values of the Constitution, accountability and openness, are at the heart of the need for and the enactment of the legislation. It certainly deepens democracy. It certainly provides a basis to promote national interest, and it certainly also seeks to protect the sovereignty of the Republic. The effect is given by ensuring that we have the measures to establish regulations around funding from private sources, and to ensure that certain sources of donations are prohibited, and also to provide for how disclosure is made. There is also reference to the funding of political parties, which at the end of the day are at the heart of our current political system, in the Constitution in section 236. And this particular provision provides for only political parties to be funded from the national purse in national and provincial legislatures on an equitable and also on a proportional basis. I'm stressing this because I think that there is, probably many of you are aware, that there is a subsequent judgment of the Constitutional Court that was issued last year in June in relation to the New Nation movement, which may well see, or in terms of that judgment needs to see, some changes being made in terms of national and provincial legislatures, whereby it's not only political parties that need to seek participation, but also individuals. However, if one looks then at the impact of section 236, section 236 has been given effect historically through the Political Funding of Represented Political Parties Act. That act has been repealed and is incorporated into the Political Party Funding Act, which establishes then in its stead the Represented Political Party Fund. And that fund has shifted the allocation as it was historically from 90% proportional and 10% equitable to now 2/3 of that fund to be allocated on a proportional basis and 1/3 on an equitable basis, thereby giving a greater share to smaller parties. So the act, which I will cover the headlines of in this slide, really provides for the establishment of two funds, as I mentioned, the Represented Political Party Fund, but also an innovation, the Multi-Party Democracy Fund. The way in which the act is currently crafted, the allocations from either of those funds follows the same requirement. In other words, 2/3 on a proportional basis and 1/3 on an equitable basis. The political parties need to disclose donations that cumulatively reach above 100,000 per annum. They need to make these disclosures quarterly, and any donor can only give up to a maximum of 5 million rand per annum to a particular organization. Donations from foreign governments or their agencies are prohibited. Donations from foreign entities or persons can only be allowed for training, skills development, or policy development, and then only up to a limit of 5 million rand per annum per donation per organization. Donations from organs of state or state-owned enterprises are completely prohibited. And donations to members of a political party must be for political party purposes. The Electoral Commission has got the obligation to regulate dual disclosure of donations. In other words, not only must political parties be disclosing, but the donors themselves must also be disclosing separately. In addition to that, the Commission has the responsibility to manage and disperse the two funds, and the Commission has oversight powers to ensure compliance, and I'll come to some detail of that shortly. So I mentioned here just a slight elaboration of what I've said in terms of what is prohibited and what is allowed, and the caps. In particular, and in this slide as well, but in particular, I think that what's important then is what are the processes. Now, a number of political parties have got their operations taking place on a national basis. They have, for example, the opportunity for members of that political party to contribute sometimes into provincial funds, which then get managed provincially. For example, funds that are levied against elected representatives in the provincial legislatures, and even in some instances in the municipalities. Regardless of how many funds an individual political party has, each political party must have all of the direct donations, which are not dues that are levied against members, but donations that come from the various private sources, must deposit all of those direct donations into a separate bank account. Accounting officers have to be appointed, and they have to finalize statements and ensure compliance. But importantly, they have to appoint an auditor who conducts an annual audit, expresses an opinion on whether the party has complied, and in particular also must provide a list of the bank accounts that have been presented to that auditor to take into account to make sure that all of the donations are appropriately aggregated and deposited in that single account for purposes of these direct donations. So what is the enforcement capacity of the Commission? The enforcement capacity gives the Commission the power to monitor and inspect, the power to suspend payments of money and recover money that has been irregularly received or spent. It gives the Electoral Court the power to review decisions of the Commission and to impose administrative fines. I'll come back to the issues here of the understanding that we need to have of these powers, but for purposes just of reference, I think it's really important so that there is an understanding of who can do what and who needs to do what. I've listed the sections in the legislation that do deal with enforcement. So where are we now? 2 weeks ago, we publicly released the first, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, we publicly released the first quarterly report. And that was the report from April 2021 to the end of June 2021. And clearly that report is a quarterly report. So many of the requirements or indications of what need to be reported on for a period of a single year will not yet have accumulated to those annual amounts. The relationship to local government elections, well, there's doubtless some relationship, but whether or not we're at a point where we can say we're completely certain of how funding is affecting and impacting on these elections, I'm not, I doubt that that is the case, given the timing issues involved and a couple of other issues which I will mention. So if you look at PAIA, Access to Information Act, and the Political Party Funding Act, I mentioned that the two acts are aligned but are not the same. There are some critical areas of difference, and I won't go into detail, but clearly, first of all, the Access to Information Act really applies to any contestant at any level of government. The Political Party Funding Act, first of all, is focused on political parties, and in particular, deals with issues that relate to political party funding, not only in relation to private funding, but also in relation to provincial and national structures of government and the elections thereof. The second is that PAIA is not, and the legislative framework of PAIA is not, the court order does not limit or specify particular thresholds or necessarily exclusions, whereas the Political Party Funding Act does, but in fact, potentially has coverage on a much wider range of amounts. On the other hand, the PAIA applications and possible legal intervention, PAIA applications that would be required and the possible legal interventions that would be necessary exist in terms of PAIA, whereas the Political Party Funding Act tries to assign a much more organized role for the Electoral Commission. And then lastly, as I mentioned, in PAIA, you have the responsibility for provision of information would rest with the party that from whom information can be solicited in terms of PAIA, whereas in terms of the Political Party Funding Act, there is dual reporting. There is a huge amount in terms of expectations and roles. And I really wanted to indicate that as much as we can have reporting, and we are doing everything we can to enable those reports to be very easily accessed and to be tracked by the full range of organizations that have been mentioned, the reality is that some of that tracking is tracking that will need to be done in a very important way by institutions, particularly civil society, other than the Commission. When we look at investigations, there are some investigations that may be the presence of peculiar reports, the issues that are picked up from or via audits, and issues that come from problems in dual reporting, we might be able to prompt and pursue investigations. But very often, those investigations will be prompted by the kind of public reporting that citizens and civil society and the media are likely to bring. The organization has limited capacity and resources, that's the Electoral Commission, and that isn't to say that civil society have even more resources. I don't mean that at all, having been a member of such an institution, but just to say that we can cause investigations to be undertaken. We can cause actions, as you've seen, that are punitive to be pursued. But when it comes to actually getting the full range and might of penalties to be pursued, it's probably inevitable that court processes, which often don't take a short period of time, will be undertaken. And so again, we have to look at timing and impact, timing in terms of an election, and impact in terms of how that will change the views and the information provided to voters, and of course then the responsiveness of people. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'm very happy to engage further in discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Love. I'm just trying to get my camera back on. Thank you for a lovely presentation there. And as I said, I'm seeing the questions that are coming there on the chat. We will be dealing with all the questions in one Q&A session. I'd like to introduce the next speaker. It is Miss Robin Pensensi from My Vote Counts. She's a researcher there. And the topic that she will be talking about today is the journey to transparency on funding of political parties. We are mindful of the fact that we are running slightly 10 minutes late or so, but that shouldn't disturb anyone. Everyone must proceed with their presentation. Thank you very much. Over to Ms. Robin Pensensi.
Thank you so much, Robin. Thank you to the Office of the Information Regulator as well for inviting me to be part of this panel today, especially as we commemorate the Universal Day of Access to Information. Just to say upfront, I think Commissioner Janet Love covered quite a lot of information as it relates to the Political Party Funding Act itself and what it entails and what we should be aware of. So thank you very much for that, Commissioner. So on that point of the presentation, I won't linger too much because I think really a lot of information has already been given on that particular point. Okay, so let me just share my screen properly for everybody. Okay, so given that wonderful introduction, so my talk today will really just be about what has been the journey of political party funding in South Africa and what has been the context that has taken us to the point where we now have the Political Party Funding Act. So as Commissioner Janet Love already said, there is some kind of overlap in the journeys between the recent amendments to PAIA and the creation of the Political Party Funding Act. And I think, as she has so rightly mentioned as well, these are two very separate pieces of legislation, but in some aspects they are interrelated. So on the point of party funding, of wanting that access to information, I think first and foremost, it's important to note that this conversation did not just arise in the last 2 or 3 years. This is really a topic of conversation that has been around for quite some time, even in the immediate years following our transition into democracy. So the questions around who funds our political parties, what money do we have in our political space, has really been at the forefront. So when it comes to the litigative steps, really it began with IDUAI in 2004. So I'm just going to skip ahead a bit just so you can see some of the information here. So what happened is that IDUAI had sent requests to 4 political parties, and this was the African National Congress, the Democratic Alliance, the Inkatha Freedom Party, and the New National Party. And what they were requesting was access to their private funding information, and they were making these requests under PAIA. Now, all their requests to the political parties were denied. So no political party of that 4 responded in kind in any way. And so the next step for IDUAI was therefore to go forward and take a legal route. So what they did was, in their application, was ask that they should be allowed access to this information. And I think very importantly, what the court was addressing here were 3 main issues as it relates to this topic. So firstly, can IDUAI and anybody else use PAIA to seek this kind of information? Is that the accurate route that they should take? Or should they in fact be making those kind of requests directly under Section 32 of the Constitution, which speaks to the access to information by the public to information held by the state? Secondly, what was also of great importance here and what continued to be of importance with the My Vote Counts court action is, how do we actually define our political parties? Are they public bodies? Are they public entities, or are they private bodies? And this is crucial for knowing whether one could actually access information under PAIA. And then lastly, is the access of this information, is knowing who funds our political parties a requirement for citizens actually being able to exercise the right to vote? So in other words, does your right to vote depend on this kind of access to information? Now, ultimately, this court action was unsuccessful by IDASA. And what the court judgment came down to was that you can only access information through PAIA. And this was through public bodies. And what the court decision was saying was that, in fact, political parties are private bodies. Now, in the intervening years, from the time of the initial court action by IDASA, My Vote Counts is established. And in 2016, My Vote Counts made an application to the Western Cape High Court, sort of taking up the mantle of IDASA, requesting that PAIA be declared unconstitutional on the grounds that voters cannot access information to private political party funding. And this is very important for the exercising of one's right to vote. So we were doing this under sections 32 of the Constitution and section 7 as well, which is in respect to the state having to protect and promote and fulfill the Bill of Rights. So what then happens here is that while we are undergoing the sort of process of checking the constitutional validity of PAIA, there is a concurrent process also happening about discussions around political party funding. So while the court is hearing the PAIA case, an ad hoc committee is established on the funding of political parties, and various public hearings are held on this matter, and a review of the current legislation of the time was held, which was the Political Funding of Represented Political Parties Act. So what comes out of this ad hoc committee is a draft party funding bill. And then in 2017, what we have is not only a draft on political party funding, but we also have the Western Cape High Court declaring PAIA unconstitutional and then giving Parliament 18 months to rectify those aspects of the act that were deemed unconstitutional. So as you may be aware, that if a piece of legislation is deemed unconstitutional, then the Constitutional Court needs to confirm this, needs to uphold this decision. So what was important for the Constitutional Court to determine in assessing this constitutional invalidity that the Western Cape High Court had found was that, do we need to reduce the risk of voters possibly electing corrupt political parties or otherwise compromised political parties, or even an independent candidate to elective office? Do citizens have the constitutional right to make an informed vote? And if so, does that informed vote include having access to information on private funding of our political parties and our independent candidates? And then lastly, do we have some kind of legal framework that actually enables this? So essentially what the Concord found was that PAIA fails to provide for access to information on private funding because it found it inconsistent with provisions 32, 7, and 19 of the Constitution. So this was very important. So out of this, what we have then is an amendment to PAIA, but we also have the Political Party Funding Act coming out of these discussions. So at the end of 2017, the bill is introduced, the Political Party Funding Bill is introduced to the National Assembly. It's adopted in 2018, and the bill is signed into law in January 2019. And then as of the 1st of April this year, 2021, the act was officially in effect. So what we have actually seen in this very brief and compressed timeline is that if we take the point of 2004, when IDASA initially sought judicial review for what it felt was an unconstitutional prohibiting of access to information, is a 17-year process of actually trying to get access to information that has now been deemed necessary, important for voters when they go out and cast their vote. This is important for the general public to know. Now, I don't want to dwell too much on the Political Party Funding Act because Commissioner Janet Love has already provided such a good, succinct overview of this. But just to mention as well that with the institution of the Political Party Funding Act, it of course repealed our previous public funding legislation on this point. Along with it, it also establishes two funds, one being the Multi-Party Democracy Fund, the other being the Represented Political Party Fund as well. As was said as well, it's very specific about the kinds of donations that are allowed, what is prohibited. And it's very clearly a framework where political parties must disclose their private sources of funding. Of course, Commissioner Janet Love spoke about this as well. The IEC is mandated to oversee this act to make sure that political parties do in fact comply with it. And I think very importantly here, and I think this is on the point of sovereignty and upholding the principle of democracy, is that the act makes clear that political parties may not receive money from foreign governments, agencies, foreign persons, entities, organs of state, or state-owned enterprises. If a political party is going to receive such funding, then it can only be under a certain set of circumstances. So this is only going to be for training, skills development, or policy development. And also very crucially, no member of a political party can actually take a donation for themselves, but also cannot take it on behalf of the political party other than for what is described as political party purposes. Now, what is also important to note about the Political Party Funding Act is that it only speaks to political parties. It is under PIA that we see the inclusion of independent candidates. So under PIA, independent candidates are also required to disclose their sources of funding. So in that way, there's also another sort of overlap between these two acts, is that both are trying to inculcate a sense of openness and transparency when it comes to political funding. So as Commissioner Janet Love already said, is that the IEC has recently published 2 weeks ago the first set of disclosures under the PPFA. And as she also correctly mentioned, this is only a first quarter result. So it's only taking place from the time that the act was in effect. So that's the 1st of April to the 30th of June. And under the provisions of the act, the IEC had 6 months from the time that the act came into effect to publish these first set of disclosures, which it did because that deadline would have been the 30th of September. So, of course, the act compels political parties to disclose all donations received above 100,000 Rand to the IEC. If a party does not obviously receive this qualifying donation, then they do not have to disclose that yet. As was also very importantly pointed out, this is an accumulated amount. So what we should be seeing in subsequent disclosure periods is that more political parties perhaps disclosing their qualifying donations. Now, My Vote Counts, along with a few other civil society organizations, have recently established the Coalition on Party Funding, which is trying to ensure greater compliance, but also a shift in political culture that sees political parties, specifically because this is what the PPFA deals with, working in the best interest of people and not in private money. So we very much understand and respect the role that the IEC plays in having to sort of administer and ensure compliance to this act. But as Commissioner Janet Love said as well, this is a rather large task, and it is incumbent upon the rest of us to make sure that we see the act working in the ways that it should. And this is particularly important for when we talk about access to information, because My Vote Counts and other activist groups and civil society organizations, what we find especially important about this sort of information is that our political parties, they are representing our political interests. They are enacting political decisions on our behalf. And we need to be able to know whether what they are doing services us and not the sources of where their private money may be coming from. And this is why this act is particularly important. So just in overview of the recent disclosure period, what we saw is that only 3 political parties, so that's the African National Congress, the Democratic Alliance, and Action SA, noted that they had qualifying disclosures, so above 100,000 Rand, and they made those disclosures to the IEC. What we noted from the IEC press briefing from when the disclosures were released is that more than 500 registered political parties with the IEC did not make disclosures, and we can perhaps assume from that they did not have the requisite threshold amount and so therefore did not disclose. If we look at the parties in the National Assembly, that means that 12 out of the 14 political parties currently represented in the National Assembly are saying that they did not receive private donations above 100,000 Rand. This is especially important now that we are in an election year. We are approaching the local government elections, and this is where this kind of access to information comes into play. And what the Concord judgment rested upon is that the public, everybody should be able to see that the person or the party that I am voting for is not likely to be involved in corrupt or otherwise illicit behaviors, and the money that is being received is actually being used to fulfill the party functions in a fair and open manner. Also, in review of the disclosure period, what was also important to note is that the Multi-Party Democracy Fund only received 1 donation. So this was 1 donation of 2,000 Rand. And what's particularly important about the Multi-Party Democracy Fund is that anybody can make a donation of any amount to this fund. And then this money gets dispersed to political parties. So this is part of the funding that they can receive. So this fund could prove to be particularly useful if we are trying to institute a practice where we are moving away from influence and power being rested with a few private individuals or corporations, and we are trying to diffuse that power and shift that to a collective ownership of our political parties and, of course, our political space. So that's something that we should also be looking out for in the subsequent disclosure periods. Now, I think this part is where we really need to look at is that, so now we have this act, it has taken almost 20 years to get to this particular point. Is there anything else that acts as a barrier to this access to information for voters, for the public? And so here there are some concerns or loopholes around the PPFA that we may want to look at. So one of these things is perhaps the high threshold amounts. So for my vote counts in particular, we recognize that the 100,000 Rand is the threshold amount currently, and that is a cumulative amount, but perhaps in the interest of having information available sooner, that threshold amount should be lowered, but also to the point of making sure that political parties are not sourcing too much money from one particular source. Now, we can't necessarily say that just because you receive money from one or a few concentrated sources, that this will necessarily mean that your political party is captured. However, what we are trying to create is a situation where that does not happen. And so we are trying to make sure that money can be sourced from multiple spaces and perhaps at a lower amount. What's also important and perhaps of concern here is really around the open-endedness of what we understand by political purpose. So the Act doesn't clearly define what political purpose is. It will be for the political party themselves to define what that means. So that could be another avenue where a political party can accept money and say they're using for political purpose, but not actually defining what that is. neither the PPFA nor PIA make any kind of provision or mention of political parties, in the case of the PPFA, or independent candidates under PIA, about investments or investment vehicles. So there's no regulation on that front. That could prove to be another space in which this legal framework can be circumvented. Another space is the donation in kind. So donations in kind must be declared under the PPFA. However, it does not include services rendered personally by a volunteer. So for example, myself in my own personal capacity, I could offer my professional services for free to a political party. So maybe legal services or PR or marketing. And under the Act, that's not necessarily, that doesn't need to be disclosed. And then lastly, which is another space that one needs to perhaps have a conversation around, is that the PPFA doesn't prohibit donations to political parties from companies doing business with the state. So as we continue to have this conversation about the proper transparency and accountability in our governing structures and in how money is sourced, that could be a possible area that we need to look into. So really the key stakeholders for the PPFA, for PIA, is really our political parties, very importantly, as our political representatives, the voting public, but also just the public at large. When we're talking about being engaged in making our voices heard, we're talking about being involved with community or grassroots organizations, activist groups, civil society at large, and of course the media as well. And these are just a few, I think, important takeaways for why this information is especially important. So I think firstly is that political parties represent us, they represent the public, they represent our interests. And it's important to know that our public representatives are actually working for us. And so therefore it stands to reason that we should have this information, because we need a transparent and accountable political funding space. We have far too many examples of corruption, of government malfeasance. We've had these kind of examples with the Zondo Commission into state capture. And what we as the public want to see is that when money is received, it's actually being spent in the appropriate way and it's being sourced from the appropriate spaces. And to this point, what we are really talking about is how party spending can affect how well a party governs. So with us having access to this kind of information, it allows us on our own, and not just through civil society organizations or activist groups, but on our own, to readily access this information so that we ourselves can also monitor where our political parties get their money from. Do I agree with this? Do I think that this makes sense? So it allows us as ordinary citizens to take these kind of decision-making tools into our own hands and see whether you really want to put your weight behind a particular political party or candidate. And that is especially important as we are during the local government elections. As well as I mentioned before, what this also helps to do is to create increased public awareness so that political parties feel beholden to people, that they know that this is where their power, their money comes from. It's from the people who vote for them. And so they should be beholden to them and not to private money or to the source of this elite funding. And of course, access to funding information allows the public to question how their political parties operate. Ultimately, always to the question of, are you working in my best interest? And I think that, as I said, as we are in an election year, speaks particularly to our more marginalized and vulnerable groups as we try and assess how best does our political space, our political leaders function for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was Robin Asensi from My Vote Counts. I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. A very interesting discussion, a very insightful discussion, discussing the lead up to the famous My Vote Counts decision and the aftermath of that. I'm looking forward to the discussions that we will have on this particular topic. Our next speaker is also no stranger to the Office of the Information Regulator. The next speaker has been always participating with IDUAI. His name is Mr. Isaac Minnaar. It's always a pleasure to have you in these platforms of ours. Just trying to get my program here to see what your topic is. He will be presenting on proactive disclosure of information and elections, a reflection and proposals for PIA amendments. Over to you.
Thank you, much appreciated. Thanks for the introduction. So I want to start by using this extract, a few quotes from a report that came out last year, which I will talk in more detail about later, which really makes the link between the right of access to information and the right to vote. Where it says in the report, in the recommendations, that it's especially important for electoral information holders to fully appreciate the relationship between custodianship of information. And I think the word custodianship is very important in this context of PIA. So on behalf of the public and the proactive release of such information in the pursuit of mutual interests of democracy, peace and stability. And that that's necessary to adhere to the principles of proactive disclosure, open government, transparency, and public accountability. A second quote is, the release of more information proactively strengthens the overall objective of holding free and fair elections. But all of this can only happen if the release of maximum information proactively needs to become a characteristic of the South African election landscape. And I would argue not only the election landscape, but the landscape as a whole. Because we will not get proactive disclosure and maximum access to information, to election information right, if we do not have build a proactively maximum information disclosure culture in the country. And for that, we need to, I would say, urgently think about reforms to PIA, which is what I'm heading towards the end of the presentation. So I quoted from this the third document, the Proactive Disclosure of Information and Elections in Africa. And just to explain where this document came from, it has two documents, I would say, as its parents. The one is the African Commission on Human People's Rights Guidelines on Access to Information and Elections in Africa. And the other one is the Declaration on Principles of Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa. And just by the way, I will post the link later on, but you will find all the documents that I'm talking about at the link that's on the screen now, but I will post it immediately in the chat immediately when I'm done. So as a result of the guidelines that was published in 2017, which had its origins within the African Model Law on Access to Information. And so really what these guidelines on access to information and elections in Africa is a practical application in a particular area of great importance to democracy, i.e. elections, of the principles that were set down in the African model law. So what's in the guidelines? In the introduction to the guidelines, it says for elections to be free, fair, and credible, the electorate must have access to information at all stages of the electoral process. Without access to accurate, credible, reliable information about a broad range of issues prior, during, and after elections, it's impossible for citizens to meaningfully exercise their right to vote. And then the guidelines go on and introduce a key principle from the African model law on access to information. This is the principle of proactive disclosure, meaning simply that the time when, like with PAIA, that people had to put in requests and wait for information and maybe get it or not get it should be over. And information should be published proactively. So what would currently go into PAIA manuals should actually be made available proactively. So, so proactive disclosure is the presumption that all information held by relevant electoral stakeholders is subject to full disclosure. And electoral stakeholders must therefore publish key information of public interest about their structure, functions, powers, decision-making processes, the decisions itself, revenue and expenditure in relation to electoral process. And when it talks about publish, it can be in any way, but it particularly says electronic means of communications, which we understand to be, it should be available online. And for those people who can't find it online, there should be alternative ways, but that online publication should be the default, plus support for anybody who cannot access the online content. Now, who are these electoral stakeholders who should proactively disclose information? It's the authorities appointing election management bodies, so information about that whole process. Election management bodies themselves, political parties and candidates, law enforcement agencies, election observers and monitors, media and online platform providers and media regulatory bodies, and civil society organizations. So everybody who can play a key role in successful elections in a particular country. Now here are just two examples of those guidelines which come in the form of a checklist. And these are probably the two shortest ones. The checklist, for instance, for election management bodies go over quite a number of pages, but here you can have an idea of the kind of information that needs to be proactively disclosed by electoral role players. So in terms of the implementation of these guidelines, the guidelines made it clear that even though it's guidelines, that there are obligations on states to implement these guidelines and create the legislative, administrative, judicial frameworks to give effect to it, facilitate the dissemination of the guidelines to all the stakeholders, essentially do training and make sure everybody understand what they need to disclose, and then also report to regional and international bodies on the state of play. Now, South Africa must still come up with its first report. We're not sure when and where it will happen, but you'll see later on the South African assessment makes specific recommendations in this regard. Let's look at the other document that I referred to, the Declaration of Principles on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa. So the first version of this declaration came out in 2002, And in the time between then and about 2014-15, the African Commission on Human People's Rights, up to 2016, adopted a range of resolutions as things progress in terms of multilateral agreements and commitments and changes in technology and new standards in access to information and information disclosure, and tasked the African Special Rapporteur in 2017 to come up with a updated draft. Now, this updated draft expanded on the initial two parts of the declaration, the one with general principles and right to freedom of expression. On the issue of the right of freedom of expression, there are significant changes and updates made, for instance, about media freedom and how states should support media and create an environment supportive for media and other information dissemination related mechanisms, and also introduce the issue of online media for the first time. Then there are two totally new issues. The first on the right of access to information, which essentially took and improved some of the principles of the 2013 model law, and established the following principles: that the primacy of IDUAI rights, meaning that access to information rights should not be overtaken by other legislation, and then maximum disclosure, proactive disclosure, protected disclosures in the public interest, and there are a couple of other principles as well. But for our purposes now, I just wanted to highlight these. The other new section is on online rights, where there are, for the first time in any similar declaration or document of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, it for the first time acknowledged that online access to information should be on the same level as offline access to information. So it's an important document for the African continent and for countries such as ours to guide us in terms of digital rights. And it acknowledged that the right to freedom of expression and access to information using the internet are central to the enjoyment of other rights and essential to bridging the digital divide. It also talks about obligations on states to provide universal internet access, bridging the digital divide, digital literacy, setting human rights standards for artificial intelligence and algorithms, open government and open data principles, and then privacy and data protection. Principle 37 is particularly important in our context, where we say that we need fire reform to make it fit for purpose in the digital age, which means people should be able to exercise their rights online, their access to information rights online. So principle 37 says states shall facilitate the right to freedom of expression, access to information online, and the means necessary to exercise these rights, meaning helping people who can't afford it. States shall, in cooperation with all relevant stakeholders, adopt laws, policies, and other measures to provide universal, equitable, affordable, and meaningful access to the internet without discrimination. In providing access to the internet, states shall take specific measures to ensure that marginalized groups have effective exercise of their rights online. Now, we all hope that government, with the support of organizations such as the Human Rights Commission and the Information Regulator, would come up with a plan that will help us to actually achieve these aspirational clauses in the declaration. Right, having looked at those two documents, which then resulted in the proactive disclosure of information elections in Africa, and actually taking the checklists in the guidelines as a basis for the report that was then compiled with the 2019 South African national provincial elections as the main reference, but also looking at electoral processes outside of that specific election. So the report made an assessment, and I just wanted to go back and just point to who compiled this report. It was commissioned by the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria, with inputs from some of their researchers and the South African Human Rights Commission, the Human Science Research Council, Electoral Institute, ISA, and the FXI all contributed to this report and looked at case studies and tested both in desk research, but in interviews and other kinds of research to see how all these stakeholders complied with the guidelines. I'm not going to go into all of the recommendations, but I should say that one of the main conclusions was that electoral stakeholders already comply with many of the requirements listed in the guidelines. But it also then lists quite a number of issues that need attention to improve proactive disclosure of electoral information. The report made three sets of recommendations. The first set is recommendations on each of the electoral stakeholders. Most of those regarding the IEC, I should say that the IEC fared very, very well in terms of those guidelines, but there were some items pointed out, some issues pointed out for more online accessibility. We're glad to see that since this report came out and with the IEC's new online portal, it seems that they took some of these recommendations to heart and started to implement some of it. One of the serious gaps compared to the guidelines was how parties actually fared in the assessment. We just looked, the report just looked at represented parties, and not even all of them, but only nationally represented parties. And of those parties, for some of them, you couldn't find even the most basic information about, for instance, the internal democratic processes, how they nominate and decide on candidates. Even in some cases, manifestos were not available online. And I also want to make the point relating to what Robin said in her last slide about possible gaps. In fact, the standards set in these guidelines for disclosure of information by parties, and not only funding disclosure, but a whole range of other disclosure, is much, much higher than what is currently set out in our legislation. And any review of legislation should look at this continental standard to make sure that we set the bar higher for disclosure of information by parties and candidates when they run for elections. There's also a whole host of recommendations about law enforcement agencies. And so some of these recommendations, and let me just highlight 2 or 3. For instance, parties should ensure that their constitutions, policy documents, election manifestos, as well as criteria and procedure for nomination and election of candidates for internal and external office are publicly accessible online. The IEC should proactively publish on its website the information disclosed by observer missions, their reports, and any actions taken by the IEC in terms of the regulations on the accreditation of observers. The names of party agents or representatives responsible for on duty at various stages of the electoral process should be published, including on the IEC or other party websites. And I think there are probably about 50 or so of these very, very specific recommendations. And we really hope the electoral stakeholders will take note of this and try their best to start implementing these recommendations in the run-up to the local government elections. Some of the general recommendations deal with, well, who should take the lead and responsibility to ensure South Africa's compliance with the regulation, with the guidelines across all electoral stakeholders. And it looked, and the report then recommends that because of the existing mandates, the Human Rights Commission, the Information Regulator, and the IEC will need to jointly oversee and facilitate the implementations of these guidelines. So, and I'm referring here to the dissemination, the training, the promotion, and the international and national reporting on compliance with the guidelines. The third important set of recommendations were about enabling reform of the enabling legislation for access to information to effectively deal with citizens' rights to information, accountability, transparency, the demands of the digital age, and including a complete review to update and improve PIA. Two key issues came out of those recommendations. One is to make proactive disclosure the default in line with the African model law. And the second one is to make it digital age friendly. So online publication of information, open data standards, so that people can exercise their rights online. The African Special Rapporteur at the time when this was published, Commissioner Mute, made very specific recommendations and brought together the two key issues: the need for PIA reform, but secondly, that the South African government should take steps to ensure that universal access to the internet becomes a reality in the country in compliance with the declaration. Now, and I'm starting to get to the end of the presentation. So let's end with a few slides on PIA reform. So this is a quote from the last Human Rights Commission report, annual report. This report highlights that legislative development in respect of PIA have failed to bring about the reform necessary to ensure that PIA can be easily utilized by ordinary members of the public while remaining fit for purpose in today's information society. Regional standards have been developed and can be relied upon to effect legislative reform. What I'm reading here to you has been a refrain over years in the Human Rights Commission's reports, and there's been no political action to try and reform PIA at all. If you read the IDUAI network shadow reports over many years, same thing, lots of recommendations on how PIA can be improved, no action. So we're therefore saying that legislative reform, access to information reform, is long, long overdue. 21 years ago was the last substantial change. I'm not talking about small adjustments such as the recent two that Jared Love referred to. But it now really needs to be made fit for purpose in the digital age, drawing on these documents that I referred to, bringing in proactive disclosure and online access as the norm, looking at all the Human Rights Commission's recommendations over many, many years and actually start implementing that, looking at problems experienced with PIA requests by not only members of the IDUAI network, but just about everybody who want to use PIA for access, and think a bit about how out of tune PIA is with deadline-driven requests, for instance, requests before elections or requests during a pandemic. And then digital records management e-government open data standard. Now, to do all of this, SANEF and Media Monitoring Africa have been working over the past 2 years or so to get the process up and running to review and update the legislation. That included last year workshops, consultations with the API network and other PIA users. And then we got a team of lawyers together, and I want to mention their names because of the big effort that they've put in. Talking about Justine Limpert-Law, Dario Milo, Avni Singh, and Priya Chetty. So they have, together with some of us, worked for months to review the legislation, look at all the input that I summarized, some of it up to now, and in fact, drafted a bill, a PIA amendment bill, that we are happy to announce today that it is now publicly available for comment and further consultation. Anybody can participate, send your expressions of interest to pia@nma.org.za. Once we've done a proper process where everybody made their inputs and we made updates, the idea is then to present it to the Information Regulator, the Human Rights Commission, and the Department of Justice for consideration by the Executive and Parliament to then look at this civil society-driven effort to update our legislation. The draft bill can be accessed. I'll put the link also in the chat in a moment. And I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minnaar. Once again, like I said, it's always very interesting to hear Mr. Minnaar talk. Now, when looking at the time, I've just noticed that we are actually already 12 o'clock. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up the floor for questions. The GCIS has been kind enough to extend our session, our Zoom session. So I'm going to go onto the chat, and I'm now going to look at some of the questions that have been posted here. Okay, we have a comment here by Hassan Lorgat. I think that was to the first speaker. I agree with Mr. Nair wholeheartedly, but I fear sometimes the rights of blind workers in private and public organizations are not fully defended. I represented a blind popular journalist at Eastwave FM, a community radio in Indonesia, who was dismissed for grounds which I think related to him supported in the workplace, various organizations, and that let him down. He's currently still unemployed. Sorry, not being supported and made comfortable at the workplace. Did not have a union, so I stepped in. Okay, so that's more of a comment. Thank you very much there, Hassan. Then I see a comment from Marcy Machu, doesn't give me the full name. The Department of Social Development, through its white paper on rights of persons with disabilities and other instruments, is trying very hard to ensure that we remove access to barriers and participation. The department have procured assistive devices accessible to members of the public. I assume that is a comment here from Michael Machubeng. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right, then we have a link here that was shared by Mr. Minnaar. Then we have here a comment, let's see who's this, by Nandipa. I believe COVID has tested response to Principle 37. What are the implications of Principle 37 on the basic human rights list as it exists? Can the speaker who spoke about Principle 37 respond to that?
So I spoke about Principle 37 about access to the internet.
Thank you. Thank you.
Which really put an obligation on states to make sure that universal internet access is achieved at some stage, well, hopefully sooner rather than later. And so the question is, I believe COVID has tested the response to Principle 37. What are the implications of Principle 37 on the basic human right list as it exists currently? I'm not sure if I fully understand the question, but I want to say on this is COVID has speeded up the reaching the ideal of universal access. We're still far, far, far from that, but South Africa is now over 60%, I think probably around 65% of internet access, which is a big jump compared to 2-3 years ago when it was just over 50%. And one of the good things that happened in terms of free access to the internet and access to free websites would be, I think there are hundreds of sites, mostly educational, but others that are now free to use. Universities who started to, and in some secondary schools as well, implementing all kinds of measures to make sure that people can do online learning. Just what we're doing here, doing a lot of our business online. So there's been huge improvements in online services and access to online services, and make it easier for people to exercise their rights online as direct results of the implications of COVID.
Thank you very much for that intervention there from Mr. Minard. Okay, let's see. Okay, I see there's another comment here from Hassan Logat. I guess the concern I have about striking a balance between institution building and developing or sustaining a vibrant civic association, ... and then internet access without a reduced data cost is not a real access or right. So once again, we have a comment there as well. May I also encourage participants to raise their hands if they would like to raise any further questions with the panel. I'm fully aware that we've gone slightly over time, but our panel members are still very much here, and it would be nice to get some questions from you, from the floor. Maybe I will ask one question, and I will ask this question to Commissioner Love. Commissioner Love, in light of the amendments that have been made to the electoral legislation and the disclosures of political parties and so forth, in terms of donations, do you think that this legislation and the amendments thereto have strengthened our democracy and increased transparency in our electoral system? It's a question for myself.
Thank you very much for the question, Prof. You know, first of all, I want to say that I think that the legislation is a critical component to the democratic process. And I think it's in fact something that by all rights should have been part and parcel of the negotiation process. So it really constitutes unfinished business. But the extent, whether or not legislation on its own addresses and resolves many of the challenges that you've raised, I think is beyond optimistic. I think the reality is it lays the basis, but in order for that basis to be realized, it honestly means that the kind of activism, the kind of commitment that we've seen that has brought us to this point has to continue with even more vigor to enable the implementation of this act to be followed through. And so I'd like to say on its own, it does make a huge difference, but I think on its own, it really lays a solid basis. But if the basis isn't exercised on, we won't have success. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a response to that question. Since I don't see any further questions here for now, may I ask a question to Mr. Ne? What do you think can be done in terms of immediate reforms to assist the blind community in getting access to information, in particular being assisted at polling stations and so forth? What do you believe are the immediate issues that need to be addressed?
Thank you for that. I think what we need to do is to make sure that information around the elections, particularly the ballot paper, the positioning of candidates at local ward levels is made available so that blind people know the appearance on the ballot paper, and therefore can make sure that when they use the universal ballot template, they're able to make their cross in the appropriate block. So there's a need for that kind of information to be shared. It's also very important, I think, that the officials at the voting station are made aware that blind people have the right to a secret vote and that they need to make the choice themselves, whether they want to use the universal ballot template, whether they want to be assisted with somebody of their choice, or they need the IEC official or party agent to assist them. And however they cast a vote, they must be given secrecy so that they can exercise that vote. So I think the aspect of providing the candidate list in an accessible format is very important.
Thank you very much.
Prof.
Thank you very much for that. Yes.
I think Ms. Nandi Pantsaluba had her hand up to raise a question.
Yes. Advocate Nzaluba, I recognize you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the presentations. I do want to go back to the question I asked, precisely because we dealing with access to information, and all these things are in the virtual space. South Africa is deeply rural. And I want again to say, COVID has actually shown that if we don't attend to internet access, we are failing the bigger part of South Africans. And I even want to venture to say, COVID has forced us to, at some point, look at access to internet as a basic human right. And at what point are we addressing that? Because the people that we vote for, the people who vote for us are in the deep rural. As we speak, they don't have access. Look at churches. Churches were not run during COVID because there is no access. So my question still stands. At what point are we able to make sure that South Africans, who we owe these rights to, have access to the internet as a right? Thank you.
All right.
If I may respond.
Mr. Minal, you want to answer that?
Yes, please. I so fully agree. This, I mean, you expressed what we all feel exactly in the right way, which is why, because there's been no legislative imperative on government to actually act on this, this is why we say PAIA is in need of urgent reform. And one of the reforms in PAIA should be universal access to the internet. So that it's not a policy issue or a strategy issue that different government departments prioritize differently. I mean, even Department of Education at some stage, they have in their budget, they have internet connectivity at schools, but there's zero budget allocated to do that. So until and unless it becomes a legislative obligation, I am not sure that we will get to where we want to be. So we need to make sure that we get it in the legislation so that it becomes an obligation to do and not a nice to have, as it seems to have been over the past years.
Thank you, Mr. Menard. And I like the fact that you've restated that internet connectivity has gone from a like-have to a must-have. And I also wish to support what Advocate Nzaluba is saying, to say that, you know, it should not just be us here in the big metros who have access to information, but it should also be the poorest of the poor and those who are as far as distant in the rural areas as possible. It's possible in other developed countries. It should also be possible in a country like South Africa that has so many riches. Okay, let's see. Are there any further questions? I see, all right. There's a question from my co-director, Mr. Dimba. Mr. Dimba, you want to switch on your mic and ask Mr. Ne yourself?
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Program Director. The question I have for Mr. Ne is with regards to the framework for public participation that Blind SA championed together with other organizations representing disabled people. The question is on the access to information recommendations from that framework for public participation. Is he aware of any public institutions that have successfully implemented the provisions or the recommendations from that framework? I would be keen to hear more about this, and perhaps you can share with the audience what some of those recommendations are. Thank you, Chairperson.
Over to you, Mr. Ne.
Thank you for that. At this stage, I'm not in a position to give you the good practice. We developed the framework after consulting with the Public Education Office of Parliament, where we find that government institutions at all spheres seem not to be able to ensure for participation of blind and partially sighted persons in various forms. It seems as if they provide you an invitation, there is a tick box that they indicate that they've consulted. So we feel that the implementations of the universal standards for web and internet is something that should be enforced by government itself, and that there should be an engagement to consult with blind and partially sighted persons in terms of what the challenges are and possible solutions that could be provided, rather than institutions taking decisions on behalf of blind and partially sighted persons without that consultation. So we've started the consultations with various institutions, and we are yet to have a commitment from these institutions in terms of their implementation of the recommendations themselves. as Blind SA, it seems that government in particular in providing access to information only responds if there's litigation. The first one we had to do was in terms of the textbooks. The Department of Basic Education had failed to provide textbooks in accessible formats to blind and partially sighted learners at the 22 schools for the blind in the country. And when there was a litigation, then there was an out-of-court settlement to make sure that there was a provision. And then they made that provision just for 1 year and seemed to have lapsed again. So I'm not, maybe we could engage with the information regulator so that we can look at measures that we put in place proactively so that we don't find ourselves constantly trying to fight for our rights, where else we could engage proactively so that there could be this provision being made so that we are able to benefit from the access to information and knowledge. Thank you.
All right. It looks like we are unfortunately coming to the end of our session. And I must say, usually these online sessions, by the time you go over time, most of the people have left and everyone is bored. But I really appreciate the fact that everyone has stayed along, even asked some questions after that. And I've also been asked by the information regulator just to give a short a word of thanks. Obviously, the first people that I would like to thank are all the panel members for taking the time to work on the presentations, to share their knowledge with us. Knowledge is power, access to information, as we are saying. So thank you very much for doing that. I would also like to give a special thank you to Ansi and Zanele. Yes, Ansi, you and Zanele, for the sign language interpretation. It was excellent. I could see the movements. You were busy. There was every second word that was being translated. And that is very beautiful. We also like to thank GCIS for making available the Zoom platform to the information regulator, the education communication team. I'd love to name them by name, but I think that would be unfair. Some soldiers would not be mentioned. So I'd also want to thank the leadership of the regulator, Advocate Takula, our chairperson, unfortunately could not be here, the CEO, Mr. Mosala, as well as EXCO. And then just from the organizational perspective, I want to thank Mr. Dimba, who stood in gracefully for myself when I couldn't connect, as well as Ms. Zondi for once again putting together a beautiful event, coordinating, taking on the questions, making sure that everything is flowing right. With those beautiful words, I'd like to say thank you, goodbye, totsiens, sanibonani, till we meet again. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day ahead.